So the International Relations Department here at home has added its voice to the chorus of condemnation against the killing of Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. The veteran reporter was shot by Israeli military troops while on assignment in the occupied West Bank yesterday. Now, the Israeli Defense Force concedes that members of their elite group did fire some shots, but they haven't claimed responsibility for the journalist's murder. Now, it's also worth noting that Abu Akleh was wearing a protective vest at the time, which clearly identified her as a member of the press. So let's get you more reaction now, get you a sense of where the South African government stands on this. Bring in the Director General of the International Relations Department, Zane Dangor, joining us via our video link from Johannesburg. And Zane, it's great to have you on the program. Thank you so much indeed for making time. I mean, let me begin with an obvious question. So many Palestinians die at the hands of Israeli troops in the occupied West Bank. What makes this killing different?
Thank you, Ayanda. And good morning to the viewers. It should not make a difference. I do think that it's made a difference this time in that the apparent, gratuitous killing of a journalist and the full glare of cameras, both from Israeli human rights organizations and other journalists. And that has sent a shockwave throughout the world. It's not the first journalist that has been killed in the occupied territories. There's been many journalists killed over the years. But perhaps this one and the nature in which it was carried out would lead to the kinds of independent investigations that is so required in the occupied territories. It's
interesting you say that, especially because so many of Shireen's colleagues, those who were there at the time of the shooting, are feeling so much more disillusioned. And in fact, they say this is at the heart of what makes this incredibly heartbreaking. There have been a lot of people, a lot of journalists who've died at the hands of Israeli troops. Israel says they're going to have some kind of investigation, but often than not, there's no accountability that follows.
Yes, I think there's a huge accountability loop when it comes to the kinds of actions taken by the Israeli Defense Force in the occupied territories. And often, the stock line is that the shooting may have come from protesters or, it was done accidentally. But what we've been seeing over a number of years is a specific targeting of journalists and protesters. So as I said earlier on, Shireen Abu Akleh, in line with all the, guidance under the Geneva Conventions, clearly wore all the signifying clothing to indicate she's a journalist and was shot in the head. And again, we saw similar attempts to deflect from who's responsible. But the video footage from, respected Israeli human rights organizations such as B'Tselem clearly indicates that this is, the fire emanated and the shooting emanated from the IDF. So I think perhaps this time, not only our voices, but the voices of all who value freedom of expression and, the protection of journalists and civilians under international humanitarian law will call for an independent investigation in regard to this incident.
Speaking about, the different voices, in a statement from your department, you say you condemn what's taken place in the strongest possible terms. And I imagine, anybody with an interest in the story will, view that positively. But what some of our colleagues have pointed out is that, sadly, this is not followed with any sanctions against Israel, who many people believe is, of course, behind what's taken place. What's your response to that?
We've tried to raise our voices in the space that we can raise our voice, which is in the international arena. So we use the institutions of global governance to try and hold Israel and others who transgress international law accountable. I do think that in this case that the Israeli authorities, together with the international community, must have an independent investigation and ensure that those who are responsible, and it's not just the soldiers who pull the trigger, it's also those who give the command and allow this to happen, that must be called to account.
Is there room for any kind of sanctions from South Africa to Israel, given what's taken place? And given, by the way, the stance that, the International Relations Department has always taken around the war between Israel and Palestine?
Look, we've been engaging with a range of stakeholders inside of Israel and Palestine and the international community about how do we best take forward the struggles for self-determination of the Palestinian people. we've been following very closely the reports coming from Israeli NGOs, human rights lawyers, and including, prominent reports about the potential transgression on the Convention of Apartheid. And we feel that's the best way for us to take this forward, is to argue in the international community that you need organized sanctions against a state that is now being found by many, not just a few lawyers, but actually prominent international human rights institutions, to be transgressing the crime of apartheid, which is an international convention that we all need to abide by. And that, we feel, is perhaps the best way to get a multilateral approach to ensuring that democracy and human rights for all people who were legally entitled to live there is achieved. So we don't think that, we will work on our own, but also work with many others in the international community to ensure that, we do put pressure on the Israeli government to genuinely go to the negotiating table around a settlement and an end to the occupation.
I hear you, and I think some will accept the strategy, but let me ask you this. Do you feel it's actually working? I mean, what Shireen's killing has done is really brought to the surface an issue which has been there for decades, right? An issue which has grown and become incredibly complex. And what's also emerged in the sentiments around her tributes is that there are a growing number of people who've become disillusioned that the occupation itself will ever end. In fact, there's now talks of managing the occupation versus, finally terminating it, so to speak. So do you feel that the line that you have taken, the strategy you've employed, is working?
Look, if you look at it over 70 years of action and condemnation on paper at the United Nations, it's not working. If you look at our own strategies over the last 24 years, by keeping the pressure and the spotlight on, one could argue that it hasn't worked. And that's why we need something new. What has been the nature of the occupation has always been in dispute. It was always a situation about Israel, the right to self-defense, and never putting the actual occupation into the spotlight. I think the most important breakthrough over recent years is the actual recognition by many that this is now a situation of apartheid, which brings in international law in a very, very different way, which begs the question, not only from us, but also in the international community, why is that situation not treated in the same way that the apartheid situation in South Africa and Namibia was treated? And hence the approach taken by South Africa and Namibia, both. So Namibia was occupied by the apartheid government, and of course South Africa was where the jurisprudence on apartheid emerged from. And we are beginning to ask the questions in the international community: should the same kind of sanctions, whether it's arms embargoes, sports embargoes, the kind of isolation and treatment of the apartheid government, should that not now be the same kind of strategies and measures done on a multilateral basis, be instituted in relation to Israel and the occupation, because the similarities are very, very, very clear.
Yeah.
So I think that is the approach that we are taking.
I imagine, of course, there are a whole lot of things that complicate this. One of them is that whilst the U.S. government has also condemned Shireen's killing, they have an interesting relationship with Israel, don't they? I mean, in terms of the amount of funds that the U.S. has sent to Israel. And the irony here is that the gun that fired the shot that killed Shireen, who, by the way, is an American Palestinian, may very well have been funded by American dollars, which makes this incredibly interesting or difficult, if not, anything worse.
That's very true. We've seen the statements coming from the State Department. We welcome it, but we also, call on the U.S. to join us in calling for an independent investigation. And an investigation that wouldn't seek to deflect responsibility away from Israel, but an investigation that actually, uses the available evidence which all points to the IDF and to hold Israel to account. You're very right. I think there's a special relationship between the U.S., but also many in the West in relation to Israel. So, actions that they would easily call out when it is any other country is a lot more difficult for them to call out when it is actually Israel. And this is the kind of hypocrisy in the international arena that we tend to call out as well.
Absolutely. Well, it certainly is a heartbreaking story, and at the very least, hopefully there's closure. for Shireen's colleagues and her family and friends. Zane Dangor, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Really do appreciate it. Zane is the Director General at the International Relations Department of South Africa.